Today we're talking about the classic minor jazz standard, softly as in a morning sunrise. We'll take a look at the chords to figure out the most efficient way to learn it, as well as some harmonic secrets within the tune that will help us improvise over it. Let's do this thing. So softly as in a morning sunrise is a classic jam session jazz standard. It's a minor jazz standard and a really important one to know. So if you're not familiar with it, here's what it sounds like. So that's the two A sections of Softly as in a Morning Sunrise. Now, the melody is really important to learn, and I would highly recommend doing it by ear. Now, if you have no idea how to learn a melody by ear, that's completely brand new to you, never done it before, then I recommend using my LIST process for learning jazz standards. That stands for listen, internalize, sing, and transfer. And I have a completely free guide that will help you learn how to do that called Learn Jazz Standards the Smart Way. So you can find that in the description as well as the show notes. But moving on and taking a look at this chords analysis, our very first chord is C minor 7. And we also know that is the key of the tune because we have 3 flats in the key signature, which means that we are in the key of C minor. So the very first chord is C minor. We know we're in the key of C minor. Now let's take a look at the first 4 bars. So we have C minor followed by a D minor 7 flat 5, G7 flat 9 to a C minor 7. So D minor 7 flat 9, G7 to C minor 7. Now this is what we call a minor 2-5-1. Okay, now the 2-5-1, most important chord progression in all of jazz. Really get used to seeing these both in major and minor keys. And always when I'm looking at a minor key, I'm looking to see, is the 2 chord a half diminished chord, meaning a minor 7 flat 5. So in our case, a D minor 7 flat 5, right? And that way I automatically know that we're dealing with a 2-5-1 in a minor key. Now, oftentimes in minor keys, you'll see an altered extension, like a G7. In this case, we have a G7 flat 9, but in jazz, it's also important to know that we can do a lot of different things to these chords. We could do a flat 13 chord, right? We could do a sharp 9 chord, right? We could do technically a sharp 11 chord as well, but really any altered extension that resolves back to your 1 chord, right? So to start off the tune, all we really have is a 1, C minor 7, 2, 5, 1, and then bar 4, 2, 5, 1. Okay? And we're gonna go back and talk about some alternate changes that we can play over this in 1 second, but continuing on through the rest of this A section, we once again have a D minor 7, a 2, 5, 1, and then we have something called a tritone substitution, A flat 7 to G7, which is a 5 chord, going back to our 1 chord for our second A section. Okay, so tritone substitution. Let's talk about what this A flat 7 chord is. Okay, so tritone substitution is where you're substituting a chord with a dominant 7th chord, a tritone interval away. So in this particular case, it's a tritone sub of 2. So remember, what is the 2 chord in C minor 7? We discussed that it's D minor 7 flat 5. So now all we really need to know is what is a tritone interval away? Well, you can think of it as a flat 5 or a sharp 4 away. So a tritone away from D is A flat. Okay, so hence tritone substitution. So we're taking a dominant 7th chord, in this case, A flat 7, a tritone away from our 2 chord, right? And it works really nicely because we have an A flat 7 tritone sub, resolves a half step down to our G7, our dominant 7-5 chord that resolves to our 1 chord. So we do this a lot actually in, you know, in blues, right? We have this, because it really works. Right, it really works to outline that A flat 7. Really really makes a bluesy sound. So a tritone sub of 2 is a really great technique that you can learn in blues, okay? But let's go ahead and really quickly talk about this first A section right here, because you'll see above the first 2 bars that I have some alternate changes, right? Because we have our basic 1, 2, 5, 1, and that's actually pretty simple as long as you understand what those chord progressions are. It's really just 1, 2, 5, 1, 1, 2, 5, 1. We just have the tritone sub at the end to turn us around back to the second A section, right? So fairly simple, but what can happen a lot when we're comping or improvising over a tune like Softly as a Morning Sunrise is it can all start to sound very monotonous and the same. So it can be helpful to have some substitutions. So let's go ahead and go over this first substitution that we can do. And it's very simple. So what we can do is go 1, then 6, which is E flat major 7, to 2, 5, right? So 1, 6, 2, 5, right? So 1, 6, 2, 5, 1. That's one substitution we could do. But if you really want to dig into the blues, another substitution we can do for the 1, 2, 5 is 1, flat 7. Okay, it's B flat 7. So C minor 7, flat 7, then the tritone sub of 2 that we talked about to the G7. And you hear this all the time in blues shuffle stuff, like, right? So we hear this all the time. So that's 1, flat 7, tritone sub of 2, 5 to 1, right? So those are some different options that you can play to kind of keep this song fresh and interesting. Now, by the way, totally goes without saying, one of the best ways to memorize this tune and of course not get lost in the sea of 1, 2, 5s is to really know that melody well. Right? And if you're able to associate that with each chord, right? That was 2, 5 to 1. So associating the melody with chords is a really important thing to do. Have playing in the back of your head while you're improvising or comping or whatever you happen to play on your instrument. Now, looking forward at the second A section, because this is indeed an AABA form, we can see that we have a repeat of really the same as the first A with a little difference at the end. So we have 1, 2, 5, 1, 2, 5, 1, 2, 5, 1. Now, the difference though is whenever I'm analyzing chords, I always need to know what chord comes before and what chord comes after, right? So if I'm looking at the next bar here, which is F minor 7, B flat 7 to E flat major 7 in the bridge, I want to know what the heck does this F minor 7 and B flat 7 have to do with anything? Well, it's a 2-5 of 3, which is the E flat major 7th chord, which we'll talk about in a second. So 2, 5, 1. Basically, we're making a turnaround to go into the bridge. Now, before we go any further into this song, I just wanted to let you know that we actually do have a very full study of Softly as a Morning Sunrise within our LJS Inner Circle membership, which is where we study new jazz standards every single month, including Softly as a Morning Sunrise. We do chords analysis, a training video, improv exercises. We have a composed etude from our in-house composer to help you start soloing over it, and a really awesome community of other musicians doing it as well. So go ahead and check that out. I'll leave a link in the description down below or in the show notes. Okay, so now we move into the bridge, and I've actually color-coded this red, red being the relative major. Now, it's important to understand what relative keys are. And what relative keys are is when they share the same key signature, in this case, 3 flats, right? We know that they're relative keys. Basically, they have the same notes in their scale. They're just starting and ending on a different place of the scale. So, for example, if we are in the key of C minor, E flat would be the 3 chord, which is the relative major. If we were in the key of E flat major, C minor would be the 6 chord, but it's the relative minor, right? In this case, we're in a minor key. So now we're moving to the relative major, which is E flat major. Now, E flat major hangs out for 2 bars, right? And by the way, the part of the melody is right? That's the melody that we're dealing with. So E flat major 7 for 2 bars. Then we go to this E diminished 7th. We call this the flat 2 diminished, and it's a diminished substitution for the 5 of 2. Okay, we'll talk about that in 1 second. But the important thing, again, when we're looking at chords is what chord comes from before. It's E flat, then we go to E diminished, and the next chord is F minor 7. So if you look at the root bass notes, we have E flat, E to F. So we call this a passing diminished chord, right? E flat major 7, E diminished 7 to F minor 7. Now looking ahead, we also have a G flat diminished chord after that F minor 7, resolving to a G7 chord. It's the dominant 3 chord, basically, is what it's acting as, okay? So in other words, the whole bridge is chromatic moving bass notes. However, there's a few different ways to understand these diminished 7th chords, right? Because as we know, diminished 7th chords are kind of tricky to improvise over. And by the way, I would recommend when you're trying to improvise with diminished 7th chords is really focus on the arpeggios, and a better way to think about them than scales is approaching them with whole steps and half steps, the chord tones. So that's a really great way to think about improvising using the chord tones of diminished chords, approaching them with half steps and whole steps instead of thinking about playing them as a scale. But really, when we actually look at an E diminished 7th, it's actually very similar, if not the same, as the 5 chord of F minor 7, which is C7. So C7 is the 5 of F minor 7, right? So E flat diminished 7 is like playing a C7 flat 9. So if you want, you could actually think of this as E flat major 7 to C7, F minor 7 to D7, which is the 5 of G7. So the G flat diminished 7 is really the same as a D7 flat 9. So that could really help with your improvisation. Right? Think about it as a 5 chord, or right? That was like a D7 altered to your G7, right? So thinking about them as 5 chords is another way to go about it if you don't want to play the diminished 7th chords, right? But these are just some strategies to think about when you're learning the tune and understanding harmonically how they work together. Now, of course, we end the bridge with a 2-5 back to C minor 7. So D minor 7 flat 5, G7 back to C minor 7. And again, the beauty of an AABA song form is that once you learn 1A and you learn the variation at the end of the second A, you now know 75% of the tune, because the last A is pretty much the exact same as the first A. We have a 1, 2, 5, 1, 2, 5, 1, 2, 5, 1, and then that tritone sub to turn us back around to the top so we can start improvising. So the next natural question is, how do I actually go about improvising over Softly as in a Morning Sunrise? So on the screen right now, I have a video that talks about how to go from amateur to pro level jazz solos. I'm gonna give you some very specific strategies that should help you in your journey towards becoming a better jazz improviser. So go ahead and check that out on the screen right now. If you like this video, make sure you hit that thumbs up, make sure you subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next video. Cheers.